Well, good morning again. My name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm going to move this before I trip and fall, and that would be funny to watch, but then you'd have to pick me back up. All right. So we are in week 2 of our series entitled Idols. We kicked it off last week. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, but I want to ask a question as we kick off today. The question is, would you agree that we are living in some pretty delicate financial times right now? Anyone? Okay. 3 of you? No, right? I mean, yeah, right? I mean, gas is going, inflation, gas prices, and, a lot of the Fed's raising interest rates, and there's a lot of, some economists say we're in a recession right now. Some of them say it's coming. Some of them say it's going to be a big one. Some of it's going to say a small one. We when we check out the grocery line or do your online orders, before you click submit or check out, you realize now's a good time to start that diet, right? When you look at the bill, you're like, I think we're going to cut back a little bit. The stock market, enough said right on that. Stock market, And so it's a reality. We think about money a lot. We maybe stress about money. We obsess over it and stuff. It consumes our time. It's something that's on our mind. It's something that maybe even gets a little bit more attention than God does in our life, right? Where we kind of can fixate on that. We can worry about that. You don't have to raise your hands on this one, but anyone ever get stressed about money? Anyone ever worry about money and stuff? Anyone ever, if you're married, have an enlightened conversation, there we go, that's a new way of saying it, with our spouse over money and stuff? Should we buy this? Shouldn't we buy this? Do the kids really need this? We also look and say, will I have enough? Will I have enough for the end of the month? Sometimes there's more month than there is money, right? Will we be able to get the kids braces? Do they really need braces? I think they're fine the way they are. They don't need to smile the rest of their life. How are we going to pay for college? There's one, right? How are we going to pay for college? Which kidney are we going to get rid of to pay for college? It's facts. But no matter where we are in this room, and if you're younger in this room, it's just good to be a teenager. Life's good, right? Those are things that are going to come up. You probably hear your parents or grandparents or other people talk about them. And so today, what we're going to look at is bowing down to stuff. Bowing down to stuff. What does it look like to maybe have that happen? We kicked off the series last week about idols, and last week was a really hard series to preach, or a hard sermon to preach, in the sense that a lot of times when we think of idols, we think, well, that is a shrine. That's another religion that they have this metal or wooden god or this image that they set on the table and they bow down to or they pray to. Or you're like, well, that was previous, that was different religions in the Old Testament. And well, I don't struggle with idols because I don't have a little doll in my house. I don't have this thing that I go out in the backyard and bow down to or whatever. And I'm hoping, and based on some feedback I received, that it was maybe successful in the sense that we opened our eyes up. We opened our horizons up to there's a lot more things that are idols in our lives than we ever thought they might be. In fact, we kind of defined an idol in a couple different forms, but one was loving something to the level or close to the level or above the level of God. Because we came to realize there's some really good things in our life. There's some people in our life that we should love, right? We should love our children. We should love our spouse. There's a lot of things in this life that are really good, that there's nothing inherently bad with them. But when we start fixating on them, when we start obsessing, when they become what we, and here's the key word, worship, right? When they become what we, not literally probably, bow down to, but they get our attention, they get our time, they get our focus, they're what we're most concerned about, or that's what we're most concerned about, and God isn't. And I made this statement, and I think it's true, at least it's true for my life, and so maybe it's not true for you, but I think when anything gets close to competing with God for my attention, for my time, for my energy, for my focus, what I've discovered in my decades of life is that God is the one who always loses out. God is always the one who then takes second fiddle, if you will, not because of him, but because I allow these other things or these other people to start supplanting him as the number one in my life. And I shared last week, just with some authenticity that I had asked God as we were preparing this series. I said, God, is there any idols in my life? I'm sure I got this figured out. I'm sure I'm good to go. I don't need this. It's just for them. That's humor, if you don't know me. He was pretty quick to give me a few, because he's just a good dad like that. When we ask, he wants the best for us, even if that's not what we maybe want to hear. And I had shared that the first one he told me that was becoming an idol in my life was actually the church. I was worshiping the church. I was focused more on the church and reaching people, and again, not bad things by any stretch, instead of him. And the second was that I had, and it's something I can kind of fall back into pretty easily, and it's perfectly fitting for the topic today of bowing down to stuff, is financial security. Is becoming an idol to me and has over my life. I was fortunate. I mentioned I got baptized in my around 24 or 25. I was at a church. I was actually at a church in Lima, Ohio, so not too far away from here. It was an incredible church. It was a church that was growing and reaching lost people, and God was doing amazing things. And one thing I've learned in ministry is when God's doing amazing things, it takes resources to continue to do amazing things. Like when we moved out of the wreck and had to come here, you trust me, those of you who were involved in a renovation wanted us to spend the money on renovating this place, right? And some of you were part of that. It was nasty, to be blunt. And so because I was in a church like that, we were always doing things locally for missions, globally for missions, and we literally had a recurring financial campaign all the time. It was like as soon as one stopped after 3 years, the next one started, because God was just doing amazing things. It was really awesome. Now, in Scripture, God talks about this topic called tithing, or this concept called tithing. The word tithe literally means 1/10. You see it in the Old Testament, you see it in the New Testament. It's not an Old Testament thing. God affirms it, Jesus affirms it in the New Testament. And Malachi 3 essentially says that, God says this, he says the first 10% of everything, our money, is his. It's not me, you can take it up with him, Malachi 3, I'm just a messenger, okay? He says the first 10% is his. In fact, we are not giving it back, we're actually returning it to him. And then he goes on to say, if you don't, you're stealing from me. Again, that's him, not me, and I don't know if I want to steal from God. And it's the only time he says, test me. So I tell people all the time, in my life, my whole adult life, I have never tithed. Now, some of you are like, well, then you need to resign, okay? Because I was in that church in my mid-20s, God showed me that was just his starting point. And so I have always had, as an adult, 2-3 buckets. And I'm not going to, this isn't about bragging or anything, but God's always just called me to be more and more generous. And he's called Jess and I as a couple to be more generous. And it's one of the coolest things to just see how God works. Here's the caveat. I've had many times, and I just had a recent time in my life where I'm having this conversation with God. I'm sure you've had these conversations, maybe not about money, but about other stuff. And I said, God, I'm frustrated that I'm not farther ahead. I wish our mortgage was a lot less, and I wish I had more in my 401ks and 403, whatever they're in, I wish I had this. And I got frustrated. I said, and then here's the caveat. I said, and this is just being raw. I said, man, if we wouldn't have given all that, right? If we would have been, and I was talking to Jess one day, and if you have a spouse who just loves you, they speak truth to you, and she just looked at me and said, you have a scarcity mentality right now. And I said, I'm leaving, see ya, I'll come back later. Right? I mean, but truth, right? Bible tells us that good friends, and especially if our best friend is our spouse, they don't give you choice morsels. They don't tell you what you want to hear. If they really love you, they tell you what you don't want to hear because it's for your good. And so I'm in this battle like you, and God showed me that I was starting to bow down to financial security and not necessarily prosperity, but just enough wasn't enough. And then I wanted more because I was giving away more, and God said, not how it works. Not how it works. So I'm in this journey with you. We're going to look today at a guy in Scripture. A guy in Scripture had a really fascinating thing happen. Jesus tells this story about a guy in the Bible who saw his business explode in a good way. It took off. And he has a problem. He has a problem that probably all of us, I guess, wish we would have. He has too much. There's too much income coming in. In their culture, it would have been crops and yield of that. That would have been the same as getting a raise or getting a windfall. He experiences an absolutely incredible windfall, and he has a dilemma. He has to figure out, what am I going to do with all this stuff that comes in? And so we're going to pick it up. You'll see it on the screen today, and it's on Luke chapter 12. And here's what his solution is to this problem. He says this. He says, this is what I'm going to do. Aha, I got it. I got it figured out. Huge income came in, huge surplus came in. I have it figured out. I'm going to tear down my barns and do what? Yeah, yours says the same as mine. Okay. Right. I was hoping mine was wrong, but no, okay. I'm going to build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, self, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. And by the way, the phrase that's coming up is, you hear it in culture that came from the Bible. There's a lot of them like that. Eat, drink, and what? Eat, drink, and be merry. Now, let's leave that on the screen. Notice how many times in this passage he thanks God for providing for him. I mean, it's all over. He said, God, thank you so much for, oh no, right? On the flip side, look at how many times he uses the word I or me, right? This is what I'll do. I will. And I'll build, and I will. And whose grain? Whose goods? And I'll say to myself. I mean, I think it's like 10 or 11 times. You can do the math, right? I mean, he's got a me issue. Again, no show of hands needed. I'll raise them for myself, maybe for you too. Anyone ever have a me problem when it came to stuff? Right? Ours looked more like this. I worked really hard for that. I went to school a long time. I get up at 5 a.m. I work till 7 p.m. I was smart. I invested in this. By the way, if you did that, let me know which one, okay? Right? I mean, we do that, right? And then is enough enough? Anyone comfortable with their iPhone 4? Is there even such a thing, right? I mean, if it is, it probably doesn't have data anymore. You can't, right? I mean, we live in this culture. It just perpetuates it where what was new and good today all of a sudden is no good anymore. If you don't have like a 7K TV that can speak to you and hands you a soda during the game, you know, I mean, right? I mean, all of a sudden we just, how much is it? Maybe it's not quantity. That's what I want to get at too. So for some of us, maybe it is quantity of stuff, but maybe for others of us, it's the latest thing. Right? I got to have this. I got to be first in line to get, what's the latest iPhone? Where are we at? 11, 12, 16, 14, thank you. Okay, right? And 14, by the way, if 14 is the latest one, it's not going to be the latest one in a few months, okay? And I'm not knocking Apple. They do a great job. I'm just saying, like, that's just what we live in, right? I mean, it's just like, on your teenage, I mean, my kids are 8 and 6, and they're all right. I mean, Zalome's, I don't know what she's reading this list to me last night of what she wants. Like, and it's like, you already have that. You know you're not getting that. And her response is, yes, Dad, I understand. I don't want, no, right? I have to have this. Everyone else has this. And I'll probably get it for her because I'm a sap. But anyhow. For this guy, enough is never enough, right? He clings to everything he has. And not only does he cling to what he has, but all this extra came in above and beyond what he ever really even needed, right? A lot of us probably have a lot of things we don't need. That's why we have basements and stuff, right? And he goes on in verse 12, and now listen to this. Listen to God's response. That's what this guy's plan was. This was his plan, how to handle. God's response is, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? God is saying he's a fool, and get this really clear. He's saying he's absolutely foolish. Okay, God's not like calling him a bad name or inappropriate. He's saying you are so foolish. The reason you are so foolish is as simple as this, church. Because to him, enough is never enough. That's why God says he's foolish. Enough is never enough. He is bowing down to stuff. Now, is it wrong to have things? No, of course not. Is it wrong to make a good income? Is it wrong to get a raise? Is it wrong to invest? Is it wrong to save? No, all those things. The Bible actually says all those things. In fact, I think it's attributed to John Wesley. I don't know if it's him or not, how things get attributed, but his thing was make as much as you can, save as much as you can, and give away as much as you can. Actually, I think that's not too bad of theology there. See, what we learn in this passage so far is that everything we have is God's, and God is the one who gets to decide if you keep it or not. It's such a crazy thing. We actually think we're in control of all that stuff. There's not much you're in control of. Maybe I've come to believe about the only thing I'm really in control of is my response to things. That's about it, right? I mean, God is saying to him, hey, just in case you wondered, all that extra grain this year, or the reason that harvest was so good is because I just really good to you. You didn't work harder, you weren't smarter, you didn't do anything. And I can call that on account anytime I want. It's humbling, right? And we know that, right? I mean, it's very loose. We think it's so secure, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit about security and money. But we think it is, but it's really not. And then Jesus gives them these parting words. He says, and then he said to them, and that them is everyone listening, so it would be us today. This is a parable that he's telling, and he's telling about this, but there's an audience hearing this, and they would have been like, wow, this guy. And he says, watch out, be on guard, watch out. And actually, he not only says watch out, but then he adds, be on guard against what? All kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his or her possessions. I don't think I'm going out on a limb too far to say that it is really easy for us to bow down to stuff. It's really easy for us to worship money and possessions. Even on the flip side, we're talking a lot about some prosperity. It can be on the opposite side. And I do want to make mention, I know some of you today are really struggling, really hurting. You're not sure if there is going to be enough a month for money. And I empathize with you and for you. But I think we can also bow down an idol on the other side if we don't have if money's tight and all that. We can start worshiping the other way. I mean, it's a crazy thing, right? Whether we have an abundance or whether we don't have enough or whether we're in the middle, it can affect all of us in some form, shape, or fashion. Because I think for so many of us, enough is never enough. I know, again, personally, that's a struggle. That's something I have to die to almost daily sometimes because we live in a culture of comparison, don't we? I mean, all you have to do is go on Facebook, and I'm like, man, everyone else's life is perfect except mine. This is really depressing, right? And then we realize that that's just not real, okay? I'm not saying you have to post on Facebook how you just had an argument with your spouse or how you're, But what I'm saying is we live in this comparison trap. Their car is nicer than mine. Their house is nicer than mine. They have this, right? And what does comparison always do? It sucks the life out of us, right? I mean, it makes us unhappy. It makes us bitter. It makes us resentful. It makes us. I have yet to do a comparison game, and come out of that feeling better about myself, feeling healthier, feeling less stressed, feeling happier about, right? I mean, so danger alert. As soon as that starts happening, take that captive, right? And don't allow yourself to go there. Money and stuff, by their very nature, is insecure. Again, no show of hands needed, but how many of us maybe have seen 40% of our income disappear in the market this year, right? That should prove to you right now that money and stuff, by their very nature, is insecure. But yet, what do? We put our security in it. And I'm just telling you a little truth today. You will never get security in that because it's not secure by its nature. That makes sense? So if something's not secure by its nature and you and I are trying to put security in it, we're always going to be left defeated because we're trying to make something to be something that it never is. Does that make sense? And so maybe that's just what you needed to know today or hear today is quit putting your security. I'm speaking to me right now too. Quit putting your security in this because you're asking it to do something it can't do. And you're always going to be let down. He goes on in Luke 21 and he says, and he wraps it up. He says, this is how it will be with anyone. And the idea, what he talked about, this very night your life will be taken from you. Why try to put your trust and hope in things that are fleeting? With anyone who stores things for himself, and I love this, but is not rich towards God. One thing that I've put in place in my life or in our life, my wife doesn't battle this as much as me, but anytime I feel the anxious level going up of holding on to, I had someone once tell me that this is what they do, and I'm like, this is genius. So you can take it or dismiss it, it's up to you. They said anytime they feel that they're holding on to stuff, they cut a check or they make a deposit. And I've started to do that in my life. Anytime I start feeling that I'm starting to hold on, I'm starting to tear down my metaphorical barns and build bigger barns like this guy, it's always a warning sign that I'm bowing down to stuff. And my immediate response is I think I have a checkbook somewhere, but I go online and I send $100 or a couple $100 to something or someone. And guess what happens? All of a sudden, I don't feel like I'm clinging to it as much. It's so crazy how God and his economy work. By the way, just as an aside, I don't have it in my note, but God's economy never goes into recession. And some of us need to hear that today because some of us, I think, are really stressed and we're really worried and we're really anxious. And some of us have really, really, really good reasons. I don't want to dismiss that. Some of you have really good reasons for that to be rising up within. And I just want you to know this. God's economy does not go into recession. Now there's something, the Bible is true about this, and actually it's a true statement even in just logic. For every promise, there's a premise. Okay? For every promise, there's a premise. It's kind of like an if-then statement. For every promise, there's a premise. And what we see in this passage, and what we actually see in the totality of Scripture, God says, if you are faithful, the premise, if you are faithful to be generous and to be obedient to what I ask you to do with the stuff I've given you, then the promise is he will always take care of us. There's so many times in my life that I don't have anything else to hold on to. I don't have anything else to cling to except God's promises. And every single time, that's all I needed. That's just all I needed. He'll never leave me and forsake me. He will always provide. He will always be there for me. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and I'm telling you, go through the promises. Google. It's always a little dangerous, but look at several articles. Just Google God's promises in the Bible, and you'll get enough that are legit. And rest on those. He who is faithful will continue. But the question is, will you be obedient? The premise of this is that to put God first, we must pay him first. Okay? We have to put God first, and putting God first means that we pay him first. In Malachi 3, he does say, and I don't have it on the screen, but he says, the only time in all the Bible when it comes to the first 10% being his, he says, test me. Test me. You can do the word study yourself, and I guarantee, I'm 1,000% confident on it, that it's the only time in Scripture he says test. In fact, typically, all throughout the Bible, other than that passage, it says, do not put the Lord, your God, to the test. That's common throughout. And then God, because he's God, and he gets to set the rules for how things operate, and he's in charge, he's the CEO, he's the general manager. He says, in this area, bring it on. Mark's paraphrase. Bring it on. Bring it on and see, and that passage continues, if your storehouses won't overflow. In other words, bring it on and see if blessing won't show up in your life. I want to define blessing. Blessing is not if I give $100, God will give $1,000. Maybe he will, maybe he's not. He's a good dad, so he can do whatever he wants. Blessing, I define blessing as God's supernatural power working for you and me. I'm going to say that again. Blessing is God's supernatural power working for you. I told a group of guys I pray with this morning, we're going to wrap up here soon, celebrate some baptisms. I can't wait. I was telling some guys this morning, I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt. Well, let me give you a little context. So we adopted our two children a little over 4 years ago, and Dylan was 4, and they're from Bogota, Colombia, and Dylan had a pretty rough life his first 4 years. That's his story. It's not for me to share. But he had a pretty rough life. And so first time ever he comes into a family, he's way behind on about everything you could imagine being behind on, because how could you be? And if you knew his story, how could you even be remotely close? And I used to always say to my wife, I said to Jess, because everything was just a struggle for the little guy. And I said, if by the time he's in sixth grade, he's almost kind of caught up on all different levels with all their kids, that will be a monumental win. We just got to slow it down. We just got to kind of keep that in mind with his story. And I'm trying not to cry, but he's in second grade right now, and he's pretty much already there. Like, and not just academically, but socially. Some of you have known him, will attest to that. I mean, yeah, he's all boy, and he's going to be running around like crazy, but that's just him. But he has come so far in I mean, it's miraculous. It really is. I, again, can't give all the details. It's absolutely miraculous. And I am convinced, and no one's going to unconvince me, that one of the biggest reasons that he is where he is because of God has blessed our faithfulness in giving back to him what's already his. I'm convinced of that. And I've said to God, I don't, now again, in my basement times, I'll say I want more money back in return. But in my healthy times, I'll say to God, I don't care if I see a penny back if those kids thrive. If the only blessing we get as mom and dad is to see them overcome all the obstacles they overcame. We pray all the time that God would wipe out any memories from their previous story, and they've never said one word about their previous life, if you will. And that they would say, their hearts would be so tender to Jesus. I'm telling you, that boy's heart is so tender to Jesus. You'll never regret being faithful. A man's in New York City. He had a wife. His wife has this ferret. He hates this ferret. Quick transition and emotional to funny. Okay. She loves the ferret. The ferret is everything. She pets the ferret. She feeds the ferret. She combs the ferret. She does all this. He can't stand the ferret. He detests it. He's allergic to its fur. He hates the smell of its litter box. He can't stand the scratching on the fur. He can never get a good night's sleep. 1 week, his wife is away. She's gone out of town for an entire week. So he boxes up the ferret. He drives 12 hours with this ferret, across multiple state lines, and he finds a porch of a house that looks like maybe this would be a good place for a ferret. He drops off the ferret. He comes back home. His wife comes back from her week vacation or a week away, and she can't find the ferret, and she is absolutely distraught. She is absolutely heartbroken. And because he's such a good husband, he says, you know what, I love you so much. I know you love that ferret so much. I'm going to go put out signs all around town. I'm going to offer a $500 reward for that ferret. Well, no ferret was found, as you already know. And so what he does is, she's still beside herself. She's so upset. And he said, honey, I love you so much. I know that ferret meant so much to you. And so he took that sign, he changed it. He gave a $1,000 reward, put it all around town. And his buddy sees these signs one day. He said, are you nuts? Are you nuts, that stupid ferret? Why? It's not worth $1,000. Why would you offer $1,000? Have you lost your mind? No one in the world's going to pay $1,000 for a ferret. To which the man replied, he said, well, when you know what I know, you can afford to be generous. When you know what I know about God, you can afford to be generous. When you know what I've experienced about God and what he says about himself and what his track record for all human history, you can afford to not only be generous, but you can afford to trust that he'll take care of you. You don't have to bow down anymore to stuff. You don't have to allow it to stress out. You don't have to allow it to drive a wedge in your marriage. You don't have to allow it to keep you up at night. You trust the promise of the one who is faithful. Be rich be rich towards God.